please. I only wanted to help. It was just one meal. How can kindness be a crime?
Tears streamed down Claraara Miller's face as the word "fired" echoed in the noisy diner. A hammer blow shattering her already fragile world. Her manager, Brenda Vance, delivered the news with chilling detachment, citing a breach of company policy and unauthorized transactions. The transgression being Claraara's use of her own tip money to pay for a hungry, destitute man's $15 meal. The humiliation was acute as she was escorted out, her uniform stripped away. Subjected to the burning stares of co-workers and customers, she had lost everything for a simple act of kindness. Unbeknownst to her, however, the homeless man she'd helped was anything but homeless, and his reappearance the following day would not only alter her life, but would also expose the deep-seated corruption within the multi-million-dollar Kensington Erie's Inc., the very corporation that had just discarded her. The jarring 5 o'clock a.m. shriek of Claraara Miller's alarm sliced through the thin walls of her small apartment. She lay still for a moment. The familiar ache in her lower back, a dull reminder of yesterday's grueling 12-hour shift. The aroma of stale coffee mingled with the faint, sweet scent of her son Leo's lavender-scented laundry detergent, a poignant olfactory portrait of her life. A relentless cycle of exhaustion and unwavering love. Rising from bed, her bare feet encountered the cold linoleum floor. In the next room, her 7-year-old son coughed, a dry, rattling sound that always sent a jolt of fear through her heart. Leo's asthma was a constant, unwelcome presence, its severity fluctuating with the seasons, the city's pollution, and the cruel randomness of genetics. The new nebulizer sat on his bedside table, a stark, plastic reminder of their recent emergency room visit and the crushing debt it had incurred. At 29, Claraara felt 100 years old on mornings like this. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror revealed a woman she barely recognized. The bright, hopeful eyes of her youth now framed by worry lines, her once prized blonde hair perpetually pulled back in a severe ponytail, a practical necessity in the face of relentless demands. She worked as a waitress at the Golden Spoon Diner, a mid-tier establishment owned by the corporate behemoth Kensington Erie's Inc. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job. Barely enough to cover rent and keep Leo's inhalers stocked. The uniform, a drab polyester yellow dress, always carried the lingering scent of fryer oil, despite her diligent efforts to clean it. As she buttoned it, she mentally reviewed her day's checklist. Drop Leo off at Mrs. Gable's, pray for minimal traffic, remember the Wednesday soup special, clam chowder, and most importantly, tread carefully around Brenda Vance, the diner's manager. Brenda, a woman seemingly sculpted from corporate policy and burnt coffee, managed with a clipboard in one hand and a stopwatch in the other. To her, customers were mere transactions, employees interchangeable units of labor, and everything quantifiable: table turnover time, average guest check, side dish upsells, and percentage increases. Compassion was an inefficient variable she'd long ago eliminated from her management equation. "Miller, you're 3 minutes late," Brenda would inevitably declare if Claraara clocked in at 6:03 a.m., adding, "That's 180 seconds of unproductive labor costs the company has to absorb." Claraara swallowed a piece of dry toast, kissed a sleeping Leo on the forehead, whispering, "Be good for Mrs. Gable, sweetie. Mommy loves you." She left a note and a small glass of juice on the counter and stepped out into the pre-dawn chill of the Chicago streets. The Golden Spoon Diner was already buzzing with a low-level tension when she arrived. Cooks slapped bacon onto the griddle, Dishwashers clattered plates, and the other waitresses rushed around with a practiced air of joyless urgency. "Morning, Claraara," sighed Maria, another waitress, as she filled a tray with coffee mugs. "Brenda's on a warpath today. Mark Renshaw is coming." Claraara's stomach tightened. Mark Renshaw, the regional manager, was a corporate shark notorious for surprise inspections and his ruthless streamlining of operations through staff terminations. His visits meant Brenda would be 10 times more demanding, scrutinizing every detail, from coffee pours to crumbs on the floor. "Great," Claraara muttered, tying her apron. "Just what we need." The morning rush was a blur of frantic activity. Shouted orders, delivered plates, and spilled coffee. Claraara moved with practiced efficiency, maintaining a forced smile. She was polite to the grumpy old man in booth 4, who always complained about his coffee being too hot. Patient with the indecisive tourists, and even managed a genuine laugh for Mr. Henderson, a regular who told the same joke every day. Throughout it all, she remained acutely aware of Brenda's hawk-like gaze, following her every move. Brenda tapped her watch when Claraara spent an extra minute helping Mr. Henderson find his dropped mud glasses and frowned when a child spilled water, necessitating a cleanup. By midday, the rush subsided to a manageable flow. Claraara finally had a moment to breathe, leaning against the counter, rubbing her aching feet. Her tips were meager. After paying Mrs. Gable and buying groceries, there would barely be enough to cover Leo's new prescription. The familiar anxiety bubbled to the surface. She needed to make more money, more tables, faster turnovers, increased dessert sales. She needed to be the perfect employee. It was then, at precisely 1:15 p.m., that the bell above the diner door jingled, and a man shuffled in. He was the kind of person most people try to avoid. Clothes ragged, graying hair matted, face etched with the deep weariness of a life lived on society's margins. He hesitated at the door, unsure of his welcome, his eyes scanning the room with a mixture of hunger and shame. Brenda, near the cash register, saw him instantly, her lips tightening into a thin, hostile line. She was already moving towards him, ready to eject him before he could even order. But Claraara, whose section included the empty tables by the door, saw him first. Their eyes met briefly, and in his, Claraara saw not a nuisance, but profound, desperate exhaustion. Acting on instinct, she picked up a menu, stepped in front of Brenda's glare, and offered a gentle smile. "Table 41?" she asked softly. The man looked surprised, then nodded slowly. Brenda stopped, her face a mask of incandescent fury. The battle lines were drawn, and Claraara had no idea she was fighting for a man who held the power to shake the world. The man settled into the cracked vinyl of booth 7, moving stiffly as if his body ached. He hunched over the menu, though he didn't seem to be reading it, his gaze distant, hands trembling slightly as he folded and unfolded the corner of the laminated page. Claraara could feel Brenda's stare burning into her back. A blatant act of defiance to have seated him, and they both knew it. Claraara approached, notepad in hand. "Can I get you something to drink to start? Coffee's fresh?" The man looked up. His eyes, she noticed, were a surprisingly clear, intelligent blue, though clouded with weariness. Just water, please." "Thank you." His voice was raspy, unused. When she returned with the water, he still hadn't opened the menu, simply staring out the window at the bustling city, a solitary figure in the busy diner. "Have you decided what you'd like?" Claraara asked gently, maintaining a professional tone. He flinched, as if startled from a deep thought. "Oh, He looked down at the menu, then back at her, shame coloring his weathered cheeks. "What's the cheapest thing you've got that's filling?" he mumbled, eyes fixed on the table. Claraara's heart ached. She'd heard variations of that question before: the single mother, the struggling student. "The sunrise special is our best value," she said, pointing to the all-day breakfast section. 2 eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns. It's $10 or... She leaned in, lowering her voice. "The kitchen staff made a big batch of beef stew for their lunch. It's not on the menu, but it's hearty. I can get you a big bowl for $5. Comes with bread." His head shot up, his blue eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. "The stew," he said, his voice cracking. "Yes, please, thank you." As Claraara placed the order, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why she'd gone into service years ago. Before life had worn her down, it was about the simple act of feeding someone, offering comfort and care. The man, who introduced himself as Art, ate the stew with a slow, deliberate hunger, savoring each bite. He ate with quiet dignity, a stark contrast to his disheveled appearance. He cleaned the bowl with the bread, his movements methodical. Claraara kept his water glass full, checking on him like any other customer, despite Brenda's increasingly obvious glares and pointed gestures towards more profitable tables. Art was a silent observer, watching Claraara patiently explain the menu to an elderly couple, slip crayons and a coloring page to a restless toddler, expertly juggle plates, and help her co-worker Maria after she dropped a tray of glasses. Most of all, he observed her interactions with Brenda, witnessing the manager's hushed reprimands for spending too long at his table. "Your job is to maximize turnover, Miller, not run a charity," Brenda hissed. "That booth has been occupied for 45 minutes for a $5 sale. Unacceptable." Claraara simply nodded, impassive. When Art finished, he sat for a long time, nursing his water. Finally, he signaled for the check. Claraara brought it over with a small, encouraging smile. "No rush at all," she said. He reached into his pockets, patting them frantically, a look of confusion turning to panic. "Is everything all right?" Claraara asked, concern replacing her smile. "My wallet," he stammered, eyes wide with fear. "It's gone. It must have been stolen on the bus. I don't have any money. I can't pay." He looked mortified, his face pale. He started to rise, as if to flee. "I'm so sorry." This was the moment of truth. Company policy was crystal clear. If a customer couldn't pay, do not engage. Signal the manager immediately. Brenda would then call security or the police. It was a zero-tolerance policy designed to prevent theft and protect company assets. Claraara looked at the terrified man, then at Brenda, who was already watching them, suspicion in her eyes. She knew what she should do. Call Brenda. Let the impersonal gears of corporate policy crush this man. She thought of Leo, the overdue medical bill, her precarious financial situation, the catastrophic consequences of losing her job. Then she looked at Art, at the crushing humiliation in his eyes. Her own struggles, instead of hardening her, made her softer. She understood desperation. In a split-second decision that would change her life, she gave him a reassuring look, placing a hand gently on his arm. "Don't worry about it," she whispered. "Stay here. Please don't move." Before he could protest, she walked away, not towards Brenda, but towards the small pocket in her apron where she kept her tips. A $10 bill, some change. $13 total. It was her gas money, grocery money, emergency money. It was everything. With trembling hands, she smoothed out a $5 bill and 2 ones. The check was $5.45. She would use her own money, ring it up as a cash payment, and Brenda would be none the wiser. It felt like a simple, elegant, compassionate solution. She walked to the point-of-sale terminal, her back to Brenda. She typed in the table number and selected cash payment. Her hands were sweating as she opened the cash drawer. "What are you doing, Miller?" Brenda's icy voice cut through the air. Claraara froze. She slowly turned. Brenda's face was thunderous. I was just cashing out table 7, Claraara stammered. "With what money?" Brenda's voice was dangerously low. "I've been watching you. That man told you he couldn't pay, and you did not signal for a manager as per protocol." Claraara's weak lie crumbled under Brenda's intense gaze. "Open your hand," Brenda commanded. Defeated, Claraara revealed her crumpled bills. Brenda's eyes flickered from the money in Claraara's palm to the cash drawer. A cruel smile spread across her face. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. A clear breach of company policy. "So, this is how it is," Brenda said, her voice rising, attracting attention. "You are using your own funds to pay for a customer's meal. An unauthorized transaction, a flagrant violation of Kensington Erie's Policy 7B, subsection 4. Employee funds shall not be commingled with company revenue or used to settle a customer's bill under any circumstances." She recited the rule like a religious zealot. The diner grew quiet. At table 7, Art looked on, horror and disbelief etched on his face. He started to rise, but Claraara subtly shook her head. "He was hungry, Brenda," Claraara pleaded, her voice a desperate whisper. "He didn't have any money. It was $5. What was I supposed to do? Call the cops on him for a bowl of stew?" "You were supposed to follow procedure," Brenda snapped. "Procedures exist to protect this business. What happens next time? Do you give away a steak dinner? Do you start emptying the register for every sob story that walks in that door? You are not just an employee, Miller. You are a liability." The humiliation was crushing. Claraara could feel the pitying stares of her co-workers and the judgmental gazes of the customers. "I paid for it," Claraara said, her voice trembling but defiant. "The company didn't lose a single cent. In fact, you made a profit on the stew." This was the wrong thing to say. Brenda's face contorted with rage. This isn't about one bowl of stew. It's about authority, discipline, precedent. You have undermined my authority and willfully disregarded corporate policy. You have proven that you cannot be trusted. Brenda took a step back, her posture rigid. She was no longer a diner manager. She was an executioner. "Claraara Miller," she announced, her voice ringing with cold finality. "As of this moment, your employment with Kensington Erie's is terminated. You are fired." The word hung in the air, sharp and brutal. A collective gasp rippled through the diner. "Brenda, you can't," Claraara choked out, tears welling. "Please, my son, I need this job." "You should have thought of your son before you decided to become a martyr for a vagrant," Brenda retorted coldly. "Take off your apron. I'll have your final paycheck mailed to you." You have 5 minutes to collect your belongings. I will escort you out myself." Numbly, Claraara untied her apron. The cheap yellow fabric felt impossibly heavy. She folded it and placed it on the counter. Tears streamed down her face. She looked past Brenda, her gaze landing on table 7. Art was standing, his face pale, fists clenched. He looked like he wanted to speak, to scream, to tear the place down. But what could he do? He was a nobody, a homeless man who had inadvertently cost a kind woman her livelihood. Their eyes met one last time, and in his, she saw profound regret. As Brenda marched her towards the staff lockers, the silence of the diner was broken by the scrape of a chair and the clatter of something heavy. Someone had left a $20 bill on table 7 next to the half-empty glass of water. But it was too late. The gears were in motion, and Claraara Miller, mother, waitress, and Good Samaritan, was unemployed. The walk home was a blur. Claraara didn't remember the familiar route, the sounds of the city, only the phantom weight of the apron and the burning humiliation. The city sounds were muffled, as if she were underwater, drowning in despair. The 3 flights of stairs to her apartment felt like a mountain. Each step was a leaden weight, her legs trembling. The key fumbled in the lock. Finally, the door clicked open, and she stepped into the silence of her empty apartment. She stood there, her purse sliding from her shoulder, the reality of her situation crashing down. "Fired," the word echoed, mocking her. Fired for a $5 bowl of stew, fired for being kind. She sank onto her worn-out sofa, the springs groaning. She didn't cry. The tears had run dry, leaving a hollow numbness. Her mind, however, was a chaotic storm. How would she pay rent? How would she afford Leo's medication? What about food? Panic clawed at her throat. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces of her crumbling world together. She was a good worker. How could one act of compassion undo everything? Her eyes fell on a framed photograph, her and her late husband David, taken 5 years ago. They were smiling, their faces bright with a future full of promise. David had been a chef, a man who believed food was love. He would have been proud of her actions. "You always feed a hungry man," Claraara remembered him saying. "No questions asked. That's the first rule of the kitchen." David had also worked for a Kensington Erie's establishment, a more upscale bistro downtown. He'd been passionate, creative, a rising star. Then one night he'd been fired. Unauthorized use of company inventory. He'd made a birthday cake for a dishwasher whose family couldn't afford one, using flour, sugar, and eggs from the pantry. He was fired on the spot by a manager like Brenda, a man who saw only inventory shrinkage, not human decency. The dismissal had broken David's spirit. Claraara struggled to find another job, the stain on her record a constant, heavy weight. The stress, the shame, it pushed her down a dark path. A year later, David was gone, leaving Claraara alone with 2-year-old Leo and a crushing wave of grief. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. The same soulless corporation, with its inflexible policies, had destroyed her life, mirroring its destruction of David's. It was a cruel, cyclical pattern, a legacy of corporate indifference that had claimed her family twice. A fierce, burning anger finally shattered her numbness. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about David. And every individual crushed by the relentless gears of a giant corporation that prioritized rules over people. She rose from the couch and went to Leo's room. He was still at Mrs. Gable's daycare. She'd have to call and explain she couldn't afford the rest of the week's fees. Her son slept soundly, his chest rising and falling rhythmically in his small bed. The nebulizer stood sentinel on his nightstand. Claraara gently brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He was her entire world, the reason for everything she did. And now, she felt she had failed him. That realization finally broke her. Silent, agonizing tears streamed down her face. She sank to the floor, her head against his bed, weeping uncontrollably. She wept for her lost job, her shattered pride, and the uncertain future. She wept for David and the life they'd planned. She wept for the sheer, crushing unfairness of it all. As twilight deepened, casting long shadows across the room, Claraara Miller felt a profound, terrifying loneliness, a darkness she had never known before. While Claraara's world shrank to the confines of her silent apartment, another world, one of breathtaking city views and polished mahogany, was experiencing its own seismic shift. Arthur Kensington, known to Claraara only as Art, sat in the back of his chauffeured Maybach. The scent of expensive leather was a jarring, nauseating contrast to the lingering smell of grease and despair from the diner. He'd shed the ragged clothes, now stuffed in a duffel bag on the floor, and was once again impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. But the transformation was superficial. Inside, he was still the man from Table 7, horrified, ashamed, and utterly powerless. He hadn't intervened. That thought echoed relentlessly in his mind. Arthur Kensington, CEO and chairman of Kensington Erie's Incourse, a man whose words held the power to make or break careers, had watched a kind woman be publicly humiliated and fired for a simple act of kindness, a kindness he hadn't experienced in years. He'd maintained his cover, playing the part of a helpless vagrant, because his undercover consultants had warned that intervention would jeopardize the entire project. "Observe and report, Mr. Kensington," they'd instructed. "Do not engage." What a fool he'd been. This exercise, orchestrated by his PR team, was meant to reconnect him with the company his father had built. "See the front lines, Art," his father had always said. "A company's heart isn't in the boardroom. It's on the diner floor." After his father's death 6 months prior, Arthur, raised on spreadsheets and profit margins, felt a profound disconnect from that philosophy. He'd agreed to the undercover operation, expecting to uncover inefficiencies, perhaps some minor theft, issues he could resolve with a memo and revised policies. Instead, he'd found Claraara and Brenda. He'd witnessed firsthand the brutal reality of the corporate culture he'd fostered. Brenda wasn't a monster. She was a product of the system. A perfectly efficient manager by his company's standards, she adhered to policy, maximized profit, and ruthlessly eliminated inefficiencies. And Claraara, with her boundless empathy, was the inefficiency Brenda had eliminated. The Maybach pulled up to the gleaming Kensington Tower, a monument of glass and steel that now felt like a tomb. In his penthouse office on the 80th floor, the city lights spread below like scattered jewels. He'd always found this view inspiring, a symbol of his power and success. Tonight, it only amplified his feelings of smallness and isolation. "Get me Mark Renshaw on the line now," he barked at his assistant through the intercom. "And pull the complete employee file for a waitress named Claraara Miller from the Golden Spoon Diner on North Clark Street. And while you're at it, get me the file for the manager, Brenda Vance." He paced his office, the plush carpet muffling his angry footsteps. He'd seen the fear in Claraara's eyes as she pleaded for her job, mentioning her son. He'd created a system where a mother's livelihood could be extinguished over 545 missing holes. The thought was sickening. His assistant buzzed back. "Mr. Renshaw is online, sir, and the files have been sent to your secure tablet." Arthur snatched the phone. "Mark," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Arthur Kensington. I was reviewing the performance metrics for the North Clark Street Diner. Tell me about the manager, Brenda Vance." Renshaw, clearly taken aback by a direct call from the CEO, stammered. "Mr. Kensington, sir. Brenda Vance is an exemplary manager, a real bulldog. She has the highest profit margins in my district. Table turn times are down 15%, and upsells are up 20% since she took over." "And her staff turnover rate?" Arthur asked, his eyes cold. There was a pause. "Well, sir, that is slightly higher than average. But in this industry, slightly higher." Arthur cut him off, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm looking at the numbers right here, Mark. It's the highest in the entire Midwest region. She churns through employees like disposable napkins. Do you reward that?" "Her results speak for themselves, sir," Renshaw said defensively. "She's a bottom-line manager. That's what we've been incentivizing." "We've been incentivizing." The words hit Arthur like a punch to the gut. Renshaw was right. The problem wasn't just Brenda or Mark. It was him. "We're going to talk more about your incentive programs tomorrow, Mark. Be in my office at 8 a.m., Arthur said, hanging up before Renshaw could respond. He opened Claraara Miller's file on his tablet. It was sparse. Hired 3 years ago. No commendations, no demerits, just a steady, unremarkable record. He saw her address, emergency contact information, and a note about her dependent son, Leo. He swiped to the next page, to her personal information. He saw her last name, Miller, and next to it, the name of her late husband, listed as her former next of kin, David Miller. Arthur's blood ran cold. David Miller. The name echoed from the past. He quickly accessed the company's terminated employee archives, his fingers flying across the screen. He typed in the name. One result. David Miller, former line chef. Terminated 5 years ago from the Kensington Grill. Arthur vaguely remembered the incident. A regional manager had boasted about it in a quarterly meeting, using the chef as an example of someone caught giving away inventory. They'd all nodded in agreement, praising the manager's firm hand in protecting company assets. He looked back at Claraara's file, then at David's. It was the same address. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying finality. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a ghost from his company's past, a direct consequence of a culture he'd helped create and perpetuate, returning to haunt him. He hadn't just witnessed an injustice. He'd participated in the second act of a tragedy his own company had written. The view from his window now seemed to mock him. He'd built an empire on cold, hard numbers, crushing the lives of real people. People like David. People like Claraara. A profound, soul-deep shame washed over him, followed by a burning resolve. This wasn't something a memo could fix. This required more than a policy change. It required a reckoning. He buzzed his assistant again, his voice steady and imbued with a commanding clarity he hadn't felt in years. "Cancel my 8 a.m. meeting with Mark Renshaw," he said. "Clear my entire morning schedule and have my car ready at 7:30 a.m. I'm going back to the Golden Spoon Diner." The next morning, a nervous energy hung over the Golden Spoon Diner. Claraara's absence was a palpable void. The staff moved with hesitant caution, every action performed under the shadow of the previous day's brutal firing. Brenda Vance patrolled the floor like a victorious general, her posture even more rigid than usual, her presence a clear warning. She was sipping her coffee near the register when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, a rote welcome dying on her lips. Standing in the doorway wasn't a regular customer. It was a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a suit that probably cost more than her car. He was flanked by two impeccably dressed individuals, a man and a woman, both carrying portfolios. The man in the suit was tall, exuding an aura of unshakable authority. His clear blue eyes swept across the diner, taking in every detail. They were the same intelligent blue eyes Brenda had seen in The Ragged Vagrant the day before. Her brain struggled to reconcile the two images. It was impossible. She blinked, but he was still there, walking slowly toward her. "Good morning," the man said, his voice calm yet resonant with power. It was the same voice, no longer raspy, but smooth and commanding. "I believe we met yesterday. You, however, met Art. My name is Arthur Kensington." Brenda's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor and splashing hot liquid across her shoes. She didn't even notice. The name echoed in her ears. Kensington, as in Kensington Eries. The staff froze. The low chatter of the few morning customers died away. Mr. Kensington," she stammered, her face draining of color. I had no idea, sir. It's an honor. I didn't recognize you." "That was the point," Arthur said coolly, his gaze unwavering. "I came to see my company from the perspective of a customer, or in my case, from the perspective of a man with nothing, and what I saw was illuminating." He gestured to the two people with him. "This is Elizabeth Shaw, my head of human resources, and this is Michael Chen from my legal department. We're here to conduct an immediate and thorough operational review." He turned his attention to the rest of the stunned staff. "I would like to assure you all that your jobs are safe. We are here to fix what is broken, not to punish those who have been forced to work within a broken system." His gaze returned to Brenda, and all warmth vanished from his eyes. "I saw a manager who prioritizes policies over people, who values a fiber transaction over human dignity, and who fires a dedicated, compassionate employee without a moment's hesitation to enforce a soulless rule." Brenda was trembling, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. "Sir, I was just following procedure, the company handbook." "I am well aware of what the handbook says," Arthur interrupted, his voice sharp as glass. "I signed off on it, and I have never been more ashamed of my own signature. You did exactly what the system I created taught you to do, and that is the problem." He turned to his HR head. "Elizabeth, I want you to begin one-on-one interviews with every employee here. I want to know everything, unfiltered, unedited. I want to know about their struggles, their fears, their ideas." He pulled out his personal phone, scrolled through a contact, and pressed call. He put it on speaker for Brenda to hear. After 2 rings, a weary, grief-stricken voice answered. "Hello? Claraara." "Claraara Miller?" Arthur asked, his voice softening considerably. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Arthur Kensington. You helped me yesterday at the diner. I was the man at table 7. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with confusion and disbelief. I don't understand." "I know you don't. And I am so profoundly sorry for what happened to you. More sorry than I can possibly put into words. What you did was the kindest, most decent thing I have seen in a very long time. And you were punished for it. That ends today." He took a deep breath. "Claraara, I need to ask you to come back to the diner right now. There's something we need to discuss in person. It's important. It's about your husband, David." At the mention of David's name, there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Brenda's eyes widened. She knew about David Miller's firing. It was a legendary story among Kensington managers, an example of how to maintain standards. The full, horrifying scope of the situation was finally dawning on her. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Claraara said, her voice no longer weary, but filled with a new, sharp intensity. Arthur ended the call and looked at Brenda, whose face was now a ghastly white. "The woman you fired yesterday," Arthur said, his voice low and heavy with meaning, "was the widow of a man our company already failed once. You didn't just fire a waitress. You repeated history, and I was there to witness the whole shameful cycle. Now we are all going to sit here and wait for her to arrive, and we are going to begin to make it right." Claraara walked into the Golden Spoon Diner as if entering a dream. The 20-minute taxi ride, paid for by Arthur Kensington's car service, had done little to prepare her for the scene inside. Her former co-workers were gathered in small, hushed groups. Brenda Vance sat stiffly at a table, pale and silent. And in the center of it all stood the man from Table 7, no longer Art the Vagrant, but Arthur Kensington, the CEO, his powerful presence commanding the room. He turned as she entered, his face etched with deep, undisguised remorse. He walked toward her, meeting her in the middle of the diner floor. "Claraara," he began, his voice filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Thank you for coming. First, before anything else, I want to apologize. What happened to you yesterday was an unforgivable failure on my part and on the part of the company I lead. There is no excuse." Claraara was still struggling to process the surreal nature of the situation. You're the CEO?" she said, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "I am," he confirmed. "And I have been a very poor one. I lost sight of what my father built this company on. People. You reminded me of that. Your compassion, your integrity, even when it cost you everything. That is the core of what this business should be." He gestured to an empty booth. "Please sit with me." Hesitantly, she slid into the booth, and he sat opposite her. For the first time, she wasn't his waitress. They were equals. "When I looked at your employee file," he continued gently, "I found something that stopped me in my tracks. Your husband's name, David Miller. I remembered his case." Claraara stiffened. Old wounds reopened with a fresh, sharp pain. "You fired him for giving a birthday cake to a man who had nothing." Arthur didn't flinch from her accusatory gaze. He met it head on. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with regret. "We did. It was a decision made by a regional manager. But I was the CEO. I endorsed the culture that allowed it to happen. A culture that prized a few dollars worth of flour and sugar over a man's dignity and career. I see now, with a clarity that sickens me, that David's firing wasn't just a mistake. It was a moral failing, a failing that I believe contributed to what happened to him. And for that, I am truly, deeply sorry." Tears welled in Claraara's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of validation, of a long-held pain finally being acknowledged. "Claraara, I cannot undo the past," Arthur said, leaning forward, his voice earnest. "I cannot bring David back, but I can promise you, starting today, that his legacy and your act of kindness will become the catalyst for a fundamental change in this entire corporation. He paused, collecting his thoughts. I didn't come here just to offer you your job back. Frankly, you deserve better than that. I am creating a new position, a new department within Kensington Eries. It's called the Kensington Cares Initiative. Its sole purpose will be to audit and reform our company policies, to implement employee support programs, and to ensure that compassion and empathy are woven into the very fabric of how we do business. We'll establish emergency funds for employees in crisis, overhaul our management training, and create pathways for real feedback from the ground up. He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with desperate hope. And I want you to run it. I want you to be its first ever director. I don't want someone with a business degree who's never served a plate of food in their life. I want someone who understands the human cost of a bad policy. I want someone with integrity, with courage, and with a heart. I want you, Claraara. Claraara was speechless. The director of a corporate initiative? It was unfathomable. Me? I'm a waitress. I don't know how to run a department. You know how to be a decent human being, Arthur countered. That's the most important qualification. We will provide you with all the training resources and support you need. A team, an office at headquarters, and a salary that will ensure you and Leo never have to worry about a medical bill or the rent again. I'm not offering you a job, Claraara. I'm asking you to be my partner in fixing this company, to help me build a corporation that David would have been proud to work for. Across the room, Brenda Vance watched this exchange, her face a complicated mask of shock, shame, and perhaps, for the first time, a glimmer of understanding. Her world of rigid rules and cold metrics had been turned upside down by a single act of kindness she'd tried to extinguish. Claraara looked at Arthur Kensington, the man she'd fed when he was hungry. She thought of Leo, of David, of the endless, exhausting struggle. And for the first time in years, she saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Not just an escape from her circumstances, but a chance to build something better, to give meaning to her own suffering and to David's memory. A slow, tentative smile touched her lips. Okay, she said, her voice clear and steady. Yes, I'll do it. Arthur Kensington let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was the beginning of a long road, but it was a start. The Golden Spoon Diner, once the scene of a cruel injustice, had just become the birthplace of a revolution. All because one waitress chose kindness over policy, and one CEO was finally willing to see the human beings behind his bottom line. The story of Claraara Miller and Arthur Kensington isn't just about a job lost and a fortune gained. It's a powerful reminder that our true character is revealed not in how we follow the rules, but in how we treat each other, especially when no one is watching. Claraara's simple act of kindness, born from her own struggles, created a ripple that didn't just come back to her. It grew into a tidal wave of change that reformed an entire company. It proves that one person, armed with empathy, can be more powerful than the most rigid corporate policy. Her story teaches us that true strength lies in compassion, and that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most profound rewards. What seems like a thankless sacrifice could be the very thing that changes everything. If Claraara's incredible journey moved you, please give this video a thumbs up to spread the message of kindness. Don't forget to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And for more real-life stories that will inspire and amaze you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications.